Okay, welcome everybody. So, this is Mustafa Kaya. In this video, I'm going to be speaking about steppe nomads, nomads of Central Asia, first and foremost, and in a more general way, nomads, pastoralists, and their relationship with agricultural societies in Islamic history, in the middle periods of Islamic history in particular. This is a very important subject. The place of environment, the place of climate in world history, right? How human societies' relationship with their natural environment impact their life, the development of these societies, and what is the role that climate plays, environment plays in Islamic history. So these are very important subjects, obviously, have been studied thoroughly, and then recently gaining more interest in academia. In this lecture, I'm going to be brief. I'll try to focus on the introduction of these steppe peoples in Islamic history, and then the work they did, the roles they played in these periods, in the middle periods. Primarily for the purpose of this lecture, I'm thinking about the 10th century, 11th century, and the 12th century. So these 3 centuries. So I'm going to be using my slides from a class that I'm teaching for this one. Let me go ahead and start my slideshow. The Nile Delta, like Mesopotamia, the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. But for the most part, the relationship between these agricultural societies of river basins or rain-fed areas like Yemen, and then nomadic pastoralist peoples of drier areas like the Sahara, like Arabia, like Iran and Central Asia, is going to be a very important factor in the way Islamic history develops. Okay, pastoralism needs no introduction. History begins as human beings, hunters and gatherers, right? So they go, they forage, they pick. Eventually, human beings progress to the second stage of society and economy called pastoralism, which of course means human beings depending on their livestock, tending their livestock, paying attention, taking care of their livestock, and then maybe moving with their livestock, because these animals will want to migrate, and human beings, their livelihood revolves around these animals. They will migrate with them, and they live off the produce of these animals. So their livelihood will depend on their relationship with their animals, because they live off the produce of these animals, from the leather, the fur, to its tallow, to meat, and then you know eggs and so on and so forth, right? But then you have this other stage of human society we know as agricultural society. This is where we have human society multiplying in a larger degree than they used to in the stage of pastoralism. When I use these, I'm not saying this is a linear sort of a situation where it's irreversible, it's one directional, unidirectional. Not exactly so, right? It's not exactly chronological, because we do know pastoralists and agriculturists lived side by side, number one. And also, we know that it's not exactly a stage of human development, it's also a consequence of this particular society's natural circumstances. There's going to be some societies for which it will be very difficult to engage in agriculture because they live in dry areas. They will remain pastoralists even until today. I'm going to give a couple of examples. What interests us is that in our period, this progression is kind of reversed, right? So societies, regions where people were primarily agriculturalists, for example, Iran, right, come under pressure and influence of these pastoralists, and then they actually revert to being pastoralists, okay? Two major kinds of pastoralism in Islamic history. In the early periods, the one that was more dominant, played a greater role, was these pastoralists of deserts, oasis areas, right? Oasis pastoralists, primarily camel pastoralists, right? Where you have oases, regions, and then they were not necessarily very distant from each other. But the kind of pastoralism we are speaking about in this one is the pastoralism between lowlands and highlands, where you have these nomads traveling very long distances, right? In the highlands, in the summer, and in the lowlands in the winter, they're traveling hundreds of miles, right? Most of the time, these are nomads of the horse, goats, and sheep, right? I said this is not exactly a stage in human development because we do have still communities around the world engaging in pastoralist lifestyle, engaging in nomadic lifestyle. For example, some people, some groups in Romania, Bulgaria today, still, if you look at this map, right, they migrate from river basins like Danube or Maritsa, and then they travel in the summer to the highlands of the Balkan Mountains or Rhodope Mountains, right? A similar situation takes place in southern Anatolia, southern Turkey, in the Taurus Mountains. People migrate from the lowlands, coastal areas, to highlands, to the mountainous areas in the summer. So these are nomads, camel nomads, nomads of the desert, and then you have nomads of mountainous areas like this one. This image is from northeastern Turkey. So the community that we see on this photo is a tiny village, a summer village, right? So in the summer, people are here. In the winter, you're not going to see a lot of people in this settlement. But in the summer, it's enough population to justify the existence of a mosque here, as you can see, right? A couple of images of nomads of the steppe this time, right? These vast plains of Central Asia. These are all from Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, these images, right? So in this video, I'm interested in the central zone, as you see on this map, the central zone of pastoralism. In Islamic history, we speak about the middle zone, right? Stretching from North Africa, Sahara, right, including the Great Sahara, into Central Asia, right? A bit more detailed image here where we have Central Asia. So these orange areas represent the steppe. And then there is a relationship between these steppe peoples, pastoralists, and the agriculturalists they are neighboring with, right? The agriculturalists to the east, the Chinese primarily, agriculturalists to the west or southwest, peoples of Iranian, Persianate world. So this is, again, another nice map of the steppe. The steppe is a Russian term that describes the geography, these vast spaces, which for the people, for the nomads of these regions, worked as a very nice, very large pasture area, grazing area for their herd. Let's say a couple of things about how these Central Asian peoples, who were nomads, pastoralists of the horse and sheep and so on, came to be part of the Islamic world. In what way? Where did it start? And what is important about this? Okay, so it begins with one particular nomadic confederation of tribes, nomadic tribes, falling as a result of pressure from the Tibetan and Chinese empires in the 8th century. This was called the Turkic Empire or Göktürk, the Sky Turk Empire, which ruled over Central Asia, the steppe basically, coming under pressure from these two neighbors to the south and southeast. They declined, and especially when we come to the middle of the 8th century, they are overtaken, their lands were overrun by the Chinese. A very important battle takes place in 751. 751, the Battle of Talas River, which is a place right now in Kazakhstan, eastern Kazakhstan. One of the most important battles in world history. Changes the course of world history for Muslims, who were at this point primarily Arabs, for the Chinese, for Central Asia, for Turks as well. In this battle, Turks are helped by Arabs and Muslims, and then they defeat the Chinese and then overcome the Chinese invasion. So this is where we see the Chinese being unable, failing to control the Silk Road completely. This introduces Turks to the Islamic world and Islam to Central Asia, to the world of the steppe. Very important turning point in world history. So these Turks or Turkic communities are actually a group, a combination of various tribes that speak a kind of Turkic language. So under this Turkic community, we have the Uyghurs, who primarily right now live in China. We have the Karluk Turks, again, China, Afghanistan, even in India. And then we have these Turks of the Black Sea region, including the Khazars, Pechenegs, Bulgars, some of which communities have converted to religions other than Islam, right? And then finally, we have the Oghuz Turks, who have migrated from Central Asia to the Middle East over Iran, through Iran, and then later on came to be known as the Turkmens. And this is the spread of Turkic languages. Right now includes Kazakh, Uyghur, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, Tatar, and Turkmen and Azeri and Turkish, among other languages. And there's presence, as you see on this map, there's presence of Turkic languages among the Saka people in Siberia. Okay, moving on. So this was the initial introduction of Turks. 751, a very important battle between Turks and the Chinese, and Turks overcome the Chinese invasion with the help of Arabs, and then they are introduced to Islam. Muslims are introduced to Turks. The relationship develops along military lines. Very interesting, right? Under the Abbasid Caliphate, we have the idea of using slave soldiers. This is a very important subject, deserving of an independent lecture. The two words that we use to talk about this group of soldiers is number one, the Mamluk, and number two, Ghulam, right? Ghulam means, both of these words are used to mean young men, sometimes boys, but slaves. In this context, slave, enslaved soldier. Turks were purchased, brought into the Middle East by the Abbasids and by governors, by their governors as well, like the Samarras, as slave soldiers. A very important development, for example, that may be worthwhile to keep in mind was the construction of the city of Samarra. The city was built by Abbasid caliphs, particularly Al-Mu'tasim, around the middle of the 9th century as a seat of power, but primarily a seat of military power, which included a garrison, a huge camp, right? Military garrison for slave troops of the Abbasid Caliph. This tower-like figure that you see there is actually the minaret of a huge mosque in the city of Samarra. And Samarra itself was built primarily for the purpose of administration. It was a very nicely organized administrative capital. Most of the city is now in ruins. The original city, administrative capital, is now in ruins. So lots of people were stationed in the city of Samarra, and then other cities, other garrisons, the Abbasids established for these slave soldiers, for their Mamluks. From there, some of them moved on. They became officers and generals and governors. One particular example, following up with the Samarra, the city of Samarra, is the Tulunid dynasty, established by a former slave, now governor of Egypt under the Abbasids. But at some point, Ahmed ibn Tulun, who is of Turkish origin, right, decides to go independent and establishes a short-lived dynasty in Egypt. But then please follow the relationship between Samarra, north of Baghdad, and right now the mosque that he builds there, Ibn Tulun, builds in Cairo, called the Mosque of Ibn Tulun. Of course, the tower, the whole structure of the mosque is very similar. So it looks like he is bringing the architectural tastes, the idea of design in Baghdad to the city of Cairo, where he now rules pretty much as an autonomous leader, right? So something, again, we can go into further detail and in another video. So Ahmed ibn Tulun, his experiment was short-lived, but there are other attempts by Turkish rulers to establish independent dynasties that are actually very, very long-lived, right? Like the Ghaznavids, and secondly, the Seljuks, which is going to be the subject of my, hopefully, next video, right? So these earliest Turkish Islamic states are established in Central Asia and south of Central Asia, around modern-day Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and then maybe around modern-day Pakistan as well. One of the earliest ones was known as the Ghaznavids, established by a very famous Sultan, Mahmud. Another one was the Qarakhanids, and then finally the Seljuks. Also in the same period, in the 11th century, late 10th and 11th century, early 11th century, we see under the patronage of these Turkic rulers the emergence of Turkish language in the court, then Turkish literature written in Arabic script. So two of the oldest Turkish language books that we have right now in our disposal were written in this period by scholars, by bureaucrats of these rulers. One was called Kutat Gubilik, kind of like a mirror for princes work. And then the other one was even more famous, Diwan Lugat et Turk. Diwan Lugat et Turk, an encyclopedia of the Turkish language, Turkish culture, Turkish history. A very prominent work written by Mahmud el-Kashgari in Central Asia. They all date from the same region, same area, same political cultural background. This is an interesting map from Diwan Lugat et Turk by Mahmud Kashgari, showing the world centered around Central Asia. So at the center of this world map is actually the land of the Turks, known as Turkestan. Okay, so this brings us to the next important empire state established by Turks, Islamized Turks, known as the Seljuks. I am going to talk about the Seljuks in the next video. So what I did in this video was to talk about the place of climate environment in Islamic history, and particularly how it impacted the lives of nomads, pastoralists on the one hand, and agricultural settled societies on the other hand, and more pertinently to the middle periods of Islam, I spoke about Central Asia, nomads of Central Asia, those nomads who were speaking Turkic languages, and then how they come on the scene of Islamic history with the Battle of Talas, 751, number one, and their introduction into the military of Abbasid Empire as slave soldiers, as Mamluks. Okay, so I hope to continue the topic in another video. Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you soon.